don't work yourself away to build a life that you never get to enjoy. And I think sometimes we get caught so much in the success and the outcome that we're working towards that we forget why we're doing it. And I do believe that in generations now and younger are way better at this. And I applaud that. But I saw myself going into this trap and was able or hoping and still trying to pull myself out of it. And so I think it's worth a reminder. So I watched my dad work his ass off. I mean, he worked so hard to help build this company from something quite small to something quite big. And he was really, really dedicated. And as I said, he was really stressed. And I saw that came at the expense of his health. Life's too short for bad coffee or bad leadership. I'm Lindsay Yellin, executive leadership coach, coffee enthusiast, and former ad VP turned believer in leading from a place of possibility. On Unfiltered Leadership, we skip the buzzwords and dig into the messy, human, and powerful side of leadership with real conversations and practical takeaways. Now grab your mug. Let's dive in. Good morning. Welcome to Unfiltered Leadership. I say good morning because here in Half Moon Bay, it is a very foggy morning. So today calls for an extra cozy mug moment with a little bit of black tea to ease me into the day. And today, for those watching, I'm using one of my all-time favorite mugs. I don't know if I'm actually able to say that. It's really beautiful. It's a green and brown ceramic one. This was actually the first gift Carrie, my husband, ever gave me. I think it was Valentine's Day after we started dating. He had been in Colorado and found this mug at a shop with friends by an artist named Liz Aldag, I believe. And he gifted it to me with full of beans that he had roasted at this at home little roaster thing. I love it. It brings me a lot of comfort and it is just very sweet. So after all these years, 10 years, still a favorite mug. So I'm cozied up here today, and today is interesting and a big day because today's the first day that I'm actually recording a solo episode. I don't know if it's by the real book to tell you that, but we're unfiltered, so I'm going to share whatever it comes to mind to share. And I have been putting off recording one of these for as long as I've started strategizing and building this podcast, and my team would tell you that they've been watching me be blocked and pushing me to record one of these. So here we are today, but it was just a hard thing for me to do. And yesterday I was at Rebel and talking to a fellow barista and the manager of the shop. And she has her own company, this brilliant skin company, where she makes this tallow cream called Sana Sana. That's like the best thing I've used in a long time. And she wants to build her business and she's feeling blocked. And I just told her, I'm like, she's feeling blocked by marketing. And I just said, hey, don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to do what you think you need to do first. Do where you feel the least amount of resistance and just start to move and just start to act and do. So I realized I needed to listen to my own advice that I was telling my friend Martina and just start this solo episode with what felt accessible to talk about versus where I felt like I needed to talk about or what felt like the right topic for our first solo. So here we are. And today I want to reflect and share a couple leadership lessons that I've been thinking about from my dad, who passed away just over 16 years ago, back in August. And the reason this came to mind and feels relevant or accessible today is because I just got back on Monday from Hawaii. I was there for a little double vacation with my family to start, and then I met Carrie for a little baby moon. So it was like a 2-for-1. And I want to talk about the first part of that trip. So the first part of the trip was just myself, my mom, and my 2 brothers. And we had not been together on a trip like this. Actually, we hadn't been on a trip to this specific trip, Hawaii to Kona, for nearly 16 years. My mom took us after my dad passed very unexpectedly back in 2009. She took us on like a big holiday trip to bring us together after something quite traumatic. And it was an amazing trip, a great vacation. A lot of memories that we still talk about today, but as you can imagine, it was quite scattered and we were in like a trauma days and just grief days, I should say. And so we decided years later, like we really need to work on spending more time quality time together as this linear family, and we found this unique opportunity to do so, just the 4 of us. No kids, no partners, no anyone else, just the 4 of us for 5 days in this beautiful location, recreating a slice of what we had 16 years ago. So, while on this trip, it was really special. I was able to have a lot of moments just with my brothers and I, which we don't usually have, that are not cut short by meetings, by kids needing something or interrupting or other calls or, yeah, I got to hop, usually they're just quick phone calls. But here we are just sitting on the lanai of our room or by the ocean with kind of this endless time just to talk and make jokes. So, on one of these moments, the 3 of us were sitting on lounge chairs, and I think we were talking about how much my brother Josh is like my dad, like his mannerisms, even the way his hands look and the expressions he makes on his face. And we were just saying, wow, it is so much like dad. It's crazy. And my dad's name was Norm, by the way. And we were kind of laughing about that and talking about it and saying how interesting it is. And then I don't know how it got brought up, but my brother Matt, he was like, I think it was him. It was like, "Do you know how much time a year dad would spend over in Asia?" So my dad worked for a company called DM Merchandising. He was a vice president, and they made started out as like costume jewelry, and then it turned into like a big company of, I guess I'll just say, kind of knickknacks of things that were anywhere from like ever present, like birthstone jewelry to like stuff for all the different holidays, or you're in Hilton Head, South Carolina, and you go to a little tourist shop and there's a little things you can buy next to the register. That was all DM merchandising, kind of kitschy things, affordable things. And he was the head of all the creative, the design, and partnerships to bring it all to life. So he traveled to Asia back in the 90s, early 2000s, all the time. And we think it was probably about 6 to 8 weeks a year, if not more, meeting with partner companies all over Asia, China and Taiwan and Korea and Hong Kong, to build relationships when this was at the forefront of this type of business partnership, with these countries to be able to manufacture their products. And, we were talking about that, and I was like, man, I wish so much that I could just like talk to my dad, like, I'm so curious, what was it like to conduct business back then? What was it, um, like to try to build partnerships when, we were saying how so few people really were speaking English then, and it wasn't that, like, business across our countries and companies was, like, a real, you know, um regular thing. It was just at the forefront. So, what was that like traveling to these countries during this time, building these partnerships, going repetitively? What was that like? And I've been thinking about that so much, just as a leader, as someone who's building my own business, as someone who was in the corporate world. I just wish I could pick so much of his brain of what it was like to be in a business like that. And my brother Josh was like, I went to China shortly after dad passed, and I met with companies who worked with him. And yeah, I got to hear a little bit about what it was like to work with dad, and they shared some funny things and shared some really interesting things. So we were talking about that, and that just really stuck with me. And I was like, and I'll share what that is in just a little bit. But I was like, oh wow, that's really powerful. I'm like, man, with everything my dad achieved and the business that was built with his partnership and, you know, the legacy that I saw that he left, I'm like, I know was a really strong leader, and I could perceive some of those things, but I'm like, I've never really truly reflected on it, or I guess really dug into define as to why. So after this conversation, I was like, oh, there's something in this. And it had me thinking for the rest of my time in Hawaii and lingering with me today of like, what are a few of those biggest lessons that I can share coming from somebody so formidable in my life, and hoping maybe it might also spur you to think about the people that are around you that you look up to, that maybe not be in a typical leadership position, like a manager or boss or someone that you would maybe label as they're my leader, but they are in their own right to you or to others or in their lives or in their work. And what can you learn from them and reflect on? So I'm going to share a few. So the first one, I'm going to share three, is building off the story I started to tell. And it's around legacy, how to build a legacy that you are proud of. So when Josh was talking about going to China after my dad passed and meeting with his companies, what he shared is he said, you know what? One thing that they all said is that the way that dad would talk about um, working, like going over there and working with these people, with all the different employees and partners at these company was, we are all in this together. We are going to figure this out together. We are going to build this together. So he created a joint team between two disparate, different companies. He always honored that. And that was like his tried and true go back to, like, we are partners. We are going to work this out. We're going to figure this out together. And I have to imagine, between the culture differences, between the language barriers, between doing things for the first time, how incredibly difficult that was, how much patience it required, which my dad had a lot of, how much curiosity that would take to truly try to understand the people in front of you, and how to find mutual success, and do so from a place of respect and kindness and integrity. When Josh shared this, that this is what the companies had said, we reflected on the fact that right after he passed, we were gifted from his company this album. It's like a massive brown album that was not filled with pictures. It was filled with cards. And it was cards of all the different partners and people from these companies just writing to say, oh my gosh, we're so sorry. We loved your dad. We loved Norm. And like sharing like memories and just like kind words. And it was like they didn't have to do that, And so knowing and seeing that, the amount of just respect and admiration and grief coming from these partners is evident of his legacy. And Josh said when he was over there, like, they loved meeting Josh and talking about him, and it also that they shared the story that my dad had told us too, that I will never forget. And it was that one time my dad didn't like a lot of attention, but um and a lot of like pomp or circumstance or anything, but when he was over there, one time he went to one of the factories that they worked with a lot. And when he arrived and his car was pulling up, every single worker of the factory was lined up along this driveway to greet him, just to greet my dad, waving and cheering. And I think there might have been fireworks. Maybe I'm making that up, but I swear to God there was. They were just so thankful for his business, so for his partnership, for to him, that the whole company wanted to honor him as he arrived. So, and that same company wrote wonderful things after he passed. And I share all of this to say that we had us over here, his family, probably most of the people he worked with at the company didn't know what he was doing over there beyond the output and the product and like the mission of it, but didn't know probably how he conducted himself day by day, or how his principles showed up. And I think it's evident that they did. And that it is in these moments, and it's in consistency, that we build our legacies. And it's consistencies in how we show up in those principles, and more importantly, in our values, over and over and over again, with whoever it is that we are working with or speaking to or connecting with or partnering with. And we are so often just so in the moment to try to get what we're looking to achieve, or to get through. And I urge us all to spend more time as to what is it for, and what do we want our legacy to be, and how do we show up in the moments when people are watching, when they're not, with the people who are the ones giving us promotions and the ones who are not. How are we continuing to show up in those same principles by honoring those same values to us, and creating a legacy that we are proud of, that our families are proud of, that continue to be spoken about years, decades later, of the type of person that we are. It makes me a little emotional, because it's powerful to think about, and I'm grateful to have that legacy um to look back on. So the first is how to build a legacy that you're proud of. Consistency, knowing your values, and showing up in them as often as you can with everyone that you do. The second one also, I think, builds off of this story, but this idea of taking the work seriously, but not yourself. And one of the stories my brother also shared of my dad in Asia, that these companies, they said, would order all the weirdest foods, right? And just like have my dad eat them because he always would. And I think to them, they found it entertaining and funny. And I remember being on the other side of the table, another side of the country, my dad coming home and telling us these stories of fish eyes and just like crazy things that we, of course, in America did not eat ever regularly. And he would come back and he was quite brave, but also out of respect and connection to them and their culture, he would do it. And he would often come home very sick and worn down, maybe not just from the food, but just from the weary travel and the how much work he had to do. Um, but I think that too is a sign of just like they were having fun with him. And I never realized like the kind of the humor that would maybe build in these relationships, but I saw it on the other side of things. And my dad worked so hard. He's the hardest worker I think I've ever known. And he took the work very seriously. He took the company very seriously, and he was extremely, extremely dedicated. Um, However, he also liked to have a really good time, and he was like the king of practical jokes. So at home, my mom would walk past the front of the car and he'd give a little honk and make her jump, or we'd be walking in front of him at a revolving door and he'd make it stop so we couldn't move anymore. Like these little practical jokes that um, happened over and over again that we always fell for that would be amusing to him. And he would always like to create a moment of levity and joy, even if no one laughed but himself. And we began to see how this would come to life at work too. And um, I know he had a lot, like I saw him at work. I interned at his company. I'd see the relationships he had and just the joy and the banter and the laughter that would come within the culture because of just his innate personality, and that was clearly something really important to him. But I also saw this one thing that I don't know, maybe this is a little bit antagonistic, but I never will forget it. There was a guy at my dad's company, and I think he would just get kind of wound up on little things, and my dad thought it was funny. And he was really particular about this chair, his like desk chair. And for some reason, like every day or every few days, my dad one time was like, "Here, Lindsay, come here, come here." And we kind of like went to like, we're sitting in his office and we could see this other guy's desk. And my dad filled me in that he would go and take the chair and he would roll it out and like hide it next to the cubicle next door. And I can't remember if he put another chair in its place or he just got rid of it. And then we'd watch as this guy would walk in and be like, "What the, oh, where's my chair?" and get frustrated. And it was such an innocent joke, and he never knew. My dad never told him it was him. He never knew, and he was so confused, and he was trying to figure it out. And, you know, sure, not the kindest things. I'm sure so frustrating for this guy, but it gave my dad a chuckle, and it was just like this little moment of levity and joke, this practical joke on this guy that maybe he ended up telling him, maybe they had a laugh about it. I don't really know, but he, as somebody who was so busy and was working so hard, he still found the moments to create a little joy for himself and, carry these practical jokes throughout his day. And I think it's important to remember like there is a lot to be serious about these days, especially. There's a lot to be stressed about. My dad was incredibly stressed all the time from work. And I It's no different now. I know all of you are feeling that in different ways, whether from the state of the world, whether it's something going on personally, professionally. There's a lot to take seriously. There's a lot to be stressed about. But we cannot let that keeping us from seeking and savoring moments of little quiet moments of joy, or not even quietly loud moments of joy within our day. They are not getting in the way of our ability to do great work, to solve big problems, to care about things deeply. It's actually helping us create the capacity to be able to do so, to have moments of joy and connection and humor and, love. So I just encourage you that yes, take the work seriously, but you don't have to take yourself seriously, and lean into those moments. And it's okay to find joy and happiness and then get back to all the seriousness. The last leadership lesson I learned from my dad. And I think this is one that's really important for all of us, or just, I think some folks are a lot better at this now than others, but seeing it firsthand, it's one that's worth talking about. And it's, don't work yourself away to build a life that you never get to enjoy. And I think sometimes we get caught so much in the success and the outcome that we're working towards that we forget why we're doing it. And I do believe that in generations now and younger are way better at this. And I applaud that. But I saw myself going into this trap and was able, or hoping and still trying to pull myself out of it. And so I think it's worth a reminder. So I watched my dad work his ass off. I mean, he worked so hard to help build this company from something quite small to something quite big. And he was really, really dedicated. And as I said, he was really stressed. And I saw that that came at the expense of his health. He had like debilitating migraines. He had to use an oxygen tank for. I never saw him really take care of his body or his health or nutrition. Um, his personal peace was often disrupted and he'd work long days. And he was really present for a lot within our childhood of events and sports. But there was a lot that I know and have come to learn when I was quite young that he wasn't. And like I said, he would travel for up to a couple months a year, and along with other business travel. So there was long stretches of time that he wasn't around. And ultimately, it was through, those years of sacrifice that caught up with him. And he worked so hard to want to build a life that he was proud of, that was of giving a future and retirement for him and his mom, just to relax and enjoy themselves and to travel and to create a lot of opportunity and for us kids. And we got to see that, and as we got older, he stepped back little by little and we would take these wonderful family vacations. My dad and my mom began to travel. But it was just a slice of really what I know he was working towards. And it didn't make up for the sacrifice, I believe, he could think differently, for the decades leading up to that. And my dad unfortunately passed away at the age of 60 due to health complications that I believe were triggered through all of this stress and lack of care that was needed for him, and at the sacrifice of working and providing and striving and achieving really wonderful things for us. And we are so grateful to that, but not grateful that it turned into us going through adulthood without him. And I think what's most interesting is I've watched, like, quickly after my dad passed, I watched myself, my brothers, all of us lean into that kind of trope, that achieving, striving, like throwing ourselves into work for the success, for the accolades, to honor that value or make him proud of what we saw him doing. And I know for me, a big part of it. That was what we were supposed to do. And I worked my ass off until it began to have some of the similar effects. And then I've realized too, or I've recognized in the last few years, between myself getting out of corporate, trying to build a different way of being with my own business, and watching my brothers do so in their own ways or rights, I feel like we have, been able to step out and look above and say, this isn't sustainable. This isn't okay. Striving and achieving to try to prove something or gain our value, earn our value through what we achieve is not the way to build and have the life that we want. So I share that as a reminder because I work with a lot of leaders who have similar narratives in their mind, whether something from family or something from themselves, that believe that their value comes from what they're able to achieve. And it's a trap that is, or a cup, I will say, that's never filled. Because what's enough? When I achieve enough, when I get enough, it's all circumstances that never actually lead to something where we feel like it's enough and we can stop and that we finally earned it. But you don't need to achieve anything to be valuable in who you are and what you are. yes, it's okay to have goals and want to work hard and build big things, but just remain conscious of the cost, remain conscious of what you're doing it for, the purpose, and how to, as I mentioned before, continue to do so by being within your values, without stepping out of them and sacrificing something that might prove to be too much too late. Work hard, yes, work in your purpose, but don't work so hard that for something that one day you won't be able to be around to enjoy. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. To recap my 3 leadership lessons from Norm Yellin. First of all, building a legacy through consistency in your values, through showing up with respect and integrity and being consistent with everyone that you work and speak with, and be mindful of what you're doing everything for. What do you want your legacy to be? The second, don't take work seriously, but not yourself. Give yourself those moments to enjoy the small bits of levity or joy or connection, because that's what allows us to keep moving on and help balance out all the stress and seriousness that permeates us constantly right now. And yeah, work hard, work in your purpose, do work that feels meaningful to you, build the life you want to build, but don't do so at the sacrifice of, working so hard that you towards something you're not going to be able to enjoy later in your life. And I just want to thank you again for listening to my first solo episode. I promised getting unfiltered in this space, and I think it is actually really interesting that the topic that felt most accessible or that I want to talk about today is probably one of the hardest and most vulnerable things for me to talk about. Because I don't think I ever really normally do talk about this or reflect a lot on my dad or the history. So I think that's actually pretty cool. I'm proud of that. And I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. And I hope you're able to cozy up with your mug. I'm wishing you all a wonderful rest of your week. And if you have any leadership lessons from someone that you admire and look up to, I would love nothing more than to hear them. I'll be asking for those on the socials, as I'd love to hear. And perhaps there's a follow-up episode of leadership legacies and lessons learned that we can all take from one another from those that we love and learn from in our lives. All right now. Bye.